How one engineering upgrade, the wet ammunition lining in the Sherman tank, went unnoticed by the enemy, but saved the lives of tens of thousands of American tankers and changed the course of the armored war. The history of the M4 Sherman tank began at the very beginning of World War II, when the United States was actively preparing for large-scale military operations and needed reliable armored vehicles. Already in 1940-1941, the American command realized that the existing M3 Lee medium tank was outdated morally and structurally. It had an inconvenient combat layout, and its main cannon was mounted in the hull sponson, which limited its horizontal guidance. A fundamentally new tank was required, where the main gun would be placed in a turret with circular rotation, providing better fire flexibility and effectiveness in combat. Work on the new tank began in 1941, and in September the first prototype of the M4 was ready. He went into production in 1942. The design turned out to be so successful in terms of logistics, production, and maintenance that the United States launched mass production of the M4 Sherman at dozens of factories, making minimal changes to the design. During the war, more than 49,000 M4 tanks of various modifications were produced, making the Sherman the most massive American tank of World War II, and one of the most produced in the history of armored vehicles. The main philosophy behind Sherman was not to achieve maximum fire or defensive performance, as was the case with the German Tigers and Panthers, but to balance simplicity, reliability, and mass production. The Sherman was relatively light for its class, an average of 30 to 34 tons, had a fairly powerful suspension, good driving performance, and ease of repair. From the point of view of the American command, the main advantage of the tank was that it could be quickly produced, trained crews, and repaired directly in the field. From the technical side, the M4 was a tank with a classic layout, an engine in the stern, a transmission in the front, and a crew of 5. The first models were equipped with air-cooled gasoline engines, in particular, the Continental R975, an aircraft star-shaped engine. But later versions with diesel and V-shaped multi-fuel engines appeared. The main gun used was the 75mm M3 cannon, which was initially effective against most targets, but later proved weak against heavy German armor. In subsequent versions, 76mm cannons and even 105mm howitzers were mounted on support vehicles. One of the most important advantages of the Sherman was its reliability. The tanks successfully operated in a wide variety of climatic conditions, from hot Africa to humid Europe. Thanks to the modular design and unification of components, the tank was easy to repair, and most of the parts were suitable for different modifications. In addition, the Sherman had good visibility for the crew due to the presence of viewing instruments and periscopes, as well as the convenient location of the controls. The spacious interior space allowed the crew members to perform their duties faster and leave the car in case of a defeat. Special attention should be paid to ergonomics and safety. American engineers took into account that in battle it is important not only to protect the crew with armor, but also to allow a quick evacuation. Therefore, the Sherman received wide hatches, the commander's and loader's hatches in the turret, as well as driver's and radio operator's hatches in the frontal part. Later, an escape hatch was added to the bottom of the hull. This dramatically increased the chances of the crew surviving a hit. As for the reservation, on early models, the armor thickness was about 50mm in the frontal projection, but taking into account the tilt, this provided effective protection against most German anti-tank guns of 1939 to 1942. However, as the enemy's weapons evolved, the Sherman became vulnerable, especially to 75-88mm cannons, which could penetrate it from almost any angle. Despite this, the American doctrine did not seek to create an invulnerable tank, but relied on mobility, strength, and interaction with other branches of the armed forces: aviation, artillery, infantry. The Sherman became a true symbol of American military production. It was simple, reliable, and massive. It was supplied to the Lend-Lease allies, Great Britain, France, China, and even the USSR. In the British Army, it was named Sherman 1 through V, depending on the modification, and in the USSR, it was nicknamed MCHA from M4. And Soviet tankers noted the ease of handling, smoothness, and excellent visibility. Despite the poor reservation and modest cannon, the tank was comfortable and friendly to the crew, an essential quality when life depends on how quickly you can get out of a burning car. Thus, the Sherman was conceived not as a killer tank capable of defeating Tigers alone, but as a massive, reliable, and versatile machine. He was a product of the industrial might of the United States, and the embodiment of the concept of sufficient quality and mass production. It was this philosophy that allowed the Allies to ensure tank superiority in numbers and mobility, albeit at the cost of certain compromises in armor protection and firepower. These compromises later required engineering improvements, including those discussed in the following chapters. Despite the many design advantages of the M4 Sherman tank, including reliability, ease of production, and operational efficiency, it gained a dismal reputation as an extremely flammable vehicle quite early on in the Allied and German armies. In the early years of combat use, especially in North Africa, Italy, and France, the Sherman received ironic and ominous nicknames from soldiers. Ronson, after the brand of lighters with the motto, "Ignites with the first click." Zippo, similarly after another brand of lighters, as well as Tommy Cooker. That's what the Germans called the tank, emphasizing that it fries British soldiers, whom they called Tommy. These nicknames were not just mockery. They reflected the real and statistically confirmed problems with the ignition of Sherman tanks when hit by armor-piercing shells. The problem was the vulnerability of the M4 design to detonation of ammunition. In early versions of the Sherman, ammunition was placed in the side niches of the hull, relatively high and close to thinly armored areas. This made the shells particularly susceptible to detonation when armor was penetrated, especially from the flanks. When an enemy shell hit these areas, it penetrated armor, collided with ammunition, and an explosion often occurred, causing an instantaneous fire of the tank. In such cases, the fire spread instantly, especially if the tank was fully equipped, and the crew had virtually no chance of escape. The engines used also added risk. Most of the early versions of the Sherman were powered by gasoline engines, in particular the Continental R975 aircraft engines. Although the combustibility of gasoline was often overestimated in popular perception, coupled with the vulnerable placement of ammunition, this really contributed to rapid ignition. However, subsequent analysis showed that it was ammunition, not fuel, that was the main cause of the catastrophic fires. American military engineers conducted a series of field tests, in which it turned out that piercing an empty tank did not lead to a fire, while hitting a Sherman with full ammunition, in 9 cases out of 10 caused a fire or explosion. This discovery was a wake-up call for the command. Combat use in North Africa, and especially in Normandy, demonstrated that the confrontation with German tanks and anti-tank guns was accompanied by catastrophic losses. Sherman was often hit with a single shot, and his crew either died instantly or burned alive. According to some reports, up to 60 to 80% of the damaged Shermans caught fire upon impact, which exceeded similar figures for other tanks of the time, including Soviet and German ones. In conditions of limited security, even a minimal defect in the layout turned into a deadly threat. The tankers quickly realized this risk and began to change their fighting habits. In particular, they tried to move into battle with incomplete ammunition, leaving some cells empty or even filling them with sand to reduce the risk of fire. Some crews began to cover the ammunition with additional layers of fabric, boxes, and bags in order to somehow isolate the shells from possible fragments and thermal effects. The psychological effect was devastating. Combat confidence decreased, and motivation to participate in tank combat, especially against heavy Tigers or Panthers, decreased. The crews knew that one well-aimed shot could result in instant death. Even in the memoirs of American and British tankers, the theme of fear of a fire inside the Sherman is often heard, which has been compared to a moving tomb or a furnace with gunpowder. The Germans, in turn, quickly picked up on Sherman's weak spot and began to actively exploit it. German anti-tank guns, especially the 75mm PaK-40, as well as the guns of the Panther and Tiger tanks, were capable of confidently piercing M4 armor at medium and even long ranges. Cumulative weapons, including Faustpatron and Panzerschreck, also proved to be extremely effective. If even one such munition hit the ammunition area, the outcome was almost guaranteed: fire, explosion, and death of the crew. It is important to note that the ignition problem was not so much a consequence of the incompetence of the developers as a feature of the philosophy of armored combat at that time. At the beginning of the war, American engineers did not expect such a high concentration of enemy firepower as it happened in 1943 to 1944. The concept envisioned that the Sherman would operate in a maneuverable combat environment, in close conjunction with infantry and aircraft, rather than head-on with German heavy tanks. Nevertheless, The U.S. Army Command realized that the problem could not be ignored. Not only tactical adjustments were needed, but also constructive changes. The tank body required modification to reduce the likelihood of fire if hit. In this context, engineering work began, which resulted in the famous wet firing line, a decision that radically changed the fate of Sherman and saved thousands of lives. But at the time of 1943, it was still in the future. At the same time, the Sherman remained a tank that was both reliable and deadly for its crews. And until an engineering solution was found, every exit to the front line turned into a lottery for tankers with high chances of burning alive in a metal box. After the difficult experience of fighting in North Africa, Sicily, and especially in Italy, it became obvious that the problem of spontaneous combustion of the Sherman when hit requires an urgent solution. Statistics continued to show an alarming trend. Most of the damaged tanks caught fire due to the detonation of ammunition, which almost always led to the death of the crew. The U.S. Army Command and manufacturing engineers began to develop constructive measures that were supposed to significantly increase the survivability of the tank and its crew. The result of this work was the introduction of an innovative ammunition storage technology for its time, the so-called wet ammunition storage, wet stowage. The crux of the problem was the layout of the early Sherman models. Shells and charges were placed along the sides of the hull, in relatively thinly armored niches, susceptible to flank fire. This simplified access to the ammunition, but made it extremely vulnerable. After analyzing the damaged tanks, American engineers came to the conclusion that in order to dramatically reduce the likelihood of ignition, it is necessary to change both the location of the shells and their storage conditions. This is where the idea came from to introduce passive protection, to surround the ammunition with a special liquid capable of localizing and extinguishing the flame in case of damage. The engineering solution was elegant, and at the same time technically feasible. The shells began to be placed in sealed cells filled with a mixture of water and ethylene glycol, antifreeze, placed deep inside the hull, in the turret compartment, below the track line. This arrangement not only hid the ammunition from most direct hits, but also turned the cells into a kind of firefighting capsules. In case of penetration of the armor protection and damage to the lining, the liquid poured into the compartment, cooled potential sources of ignition, and prevented the spread of fire. The tests conducted in 1943-1944 showed impressive results. If on early Sherman models with dry ammunition, the probability of ignition when hitting a tank ranged from 60 to 80%. Then on tanks with the new wet laying it decreased to 10 to 15%. This meant that the probability that a downed Sherman would catch fire and destroy the crew was reduced by 5-6 times. From a military point of view, this was a giant leap towards increasing survivability and efficiency. The changes affected not only the placement of shells, but also the entire internal design of the fighting compartment. To free up space for installation in the lower part of the building, the developers moved some of the equipment, changed the configuration of the floor, and added additional protective shields. Despite this, the comfort level for the crew was almost not affected. The Sherman was still one of the most spacious medium tanks of its time. Moreover, due to the transfer of ammunition down, the risk of injury to the crew by fragments of exploding shells decreased. If the ammunition detonated, the energy of the explosion partially went down through the bottom, rather than spreading throughout the entire internal volume. Starting in the spring of 1944, all new modifications of the Sherman, primarily the M4A176W and M4A376W, began to be massively equipped with wet ammunition. The letter W in the designation indicated the presence of this feature, from the English wet. In addition, as far as possible, some of the old tanks in warehouses and repair shops were retrofitted with a wet-laying system, especially before being transferred to Europe. Thus, by the summer of 1944, the first Shermans began to appear at the front, which outwardly almost did not differ from their predecessors, but had significantly greater survivability. Interestingly, the enemy was unaware of the change for a long time. German tankers, infantrymen with grenade launchers and anti-tank gun crews continued to operate according to outdated tactics, try to get into the side of the Sherman and cause a fire. However, in practice, new Shermans caught fire much less often, and crews began to escape much more often after being hit. This gave rise to rumors at the front that the Americans had improved something, but Wehrmacht intelligence was unable to find out the exact reason for the sharp decrease in flammability in a timely manner. The lack of external differences played into the hands of the Allies. The modifications were hidden under the armor, and the enemy had no visual signs of updating. On a strategic level, the introduction of a wet firing line has become a key moment in the evolution of Sherman. It saved the lives of thousands of tankers, reduced the demoralizing impact of losses, and strengthened the crew's confidence in their vehicles. Mechanics and tank infantry noted that the new Sherman live longer and give a chance to get out. This is especially important given that crew training was a more time-consuming and expensive process than producing the tank itself. The surviving experienced crew could be put into a new Sherman and returned to battle, while the loss of people meant the need for complete retraining from scratch. Thus, the wet ammunition was not just an engineering solution. It became part of the strategic flexibility that provided the United States and its allies with stability on the battlefield. In conditions when the quality of the Sherman was inferior to some German tanks, the ability to mass-produce vehicles with a high chance of crew survival played a key role in the protracted battles of 1944 to 1945. The American approach. 3 medium-sized but survivable tanks are better than 1 armored but without a crew. Turned out to be correct. And it was this approach that ensured the Allied armored superiority in the last years of the war. One of the most significant and tangible results of the introduction of wet ammunition in the M4 Sherman tanks was a dramatic increase in the crew's chances of survival when the vehicle was hit. If at the beginning of the war a damaged Sherman was almost guaranteed to turn into a flaming coffin, then after modernization, starting in the summer of 1944, the probability of crew survival increased significantly. The design changes not only made the tanks safer, they actually saved the lives of thousands of tankers, dramatically affecting the morale, combat effectiveness, and stability of the Allied armored units. Before the introduction of the wet ammunition storage system, the statistics were appalling. According to field reports and combat logs, 60 to 80% of the damaged Shermans caught fire or exploded. In the vast majority of such cases, the crew did not have time to leave the tank. The fire spread too quickly. The radio operator and the driver, whose hatches were located in the front of the hull, were especially vulnerable. When hit from the flanks or frontal projection, it was these areas that were often hit, and the chances of getting out through the upper hatches were drastically reduced due to flames or jammed mechanisms. However, with the transition to new wet-lined models, the situation has changed. Field tests and frontline practice have shown that, on average, only 10 to 15% of such Shermans caught fire when penetrated. This meant that in the vast majority of cases, the crew got a chance to abandon the tank, even if it was hit and disabled. A stable environment was maintained inside the tank, without an instantaneous fire, which gave at least 10-15 seconds for evacuation. For a tanker, it's an eternity. Even if one of the crew members was injured, the others could pull him out through a wide turret hatch or an emergency exit in the bottom. The improvement in the situation immediately affected the psychological state of the crews. The tankers began to trust their car. Unlike the fear that accompanied every soldier when boarding the Sherman in 1942-43, the new machines inspired confidence. Even if you were killed, you would not necessarily die. This is important not only from a moral point of view, but also from the point of view of tactical stability. Tankers were more likely to continue their combat mission under fire, knowing that the vehicle would not betray them in the first seconds of defeat, and that they could rely on interaction with the rest of the crew. In addition, reducing the mortality rate of the crew has brought great benefits to the entire system of manning armored forces. Training a tankman, especially an experienced commander or gunner, required time, resources, and training. The loss of an entire crew meant not only -5 people, but also a loss of combat experience, teamwork, and professionalism. By reducing the death rate, it became possible to maintain a corps of trained specialists who, after repairs or receiving a new tank, could quickly return to service. This became especially important during the campaign in France and the offensive in Germany, when the pace of operations was high and constant replenishment of combat-ready vehicles was required. According to some estimates, the total number of tankers rescued due to the wet, laying and improved design of the Sherman reached tens of thousands. Based on the number of vehicles produced with this system and combat losses, historians cite figures from 40,000 to 80,000 people for whom the new ammunition storage system saved their lives or allowed them to avoid severe burns and wounds. These estimates are based on a comparison of the survival statistics of the crews of early and late versions of Sherman. It is also important to note that the design changes were carried out in a complex. In addition to the introduction of wet ammunition, manufacturers added anti-fragmentation inner lining to the hull walls, which reduced the risk of injury from secondary fragments during penetration. The thermal insulation of the interior compartments has improved. Standards for the placement of flammable liquids have been revised, and fire extinguishing equipment has been added. All of this worked in the same direction, maximizing the chances of survival after the first hit. The field memoirs of American tankers confirm these changes. Many tank commanders in late 1944 and early 1945 recalled how their Sherman was shot down, but the car did not catch fire, and the crew calmly managed to get out. Some continued the battle even after the defeat, using onboard weapons to the last or switching to other vehicles. This behavior became possible only thanks to the confident knowledge that the new modification will give you a chance to survive. In addition to the direct benefits in the form of saved lives, the effect of Sherman modernization also affected the attitude of the command towards tank design in general. For the first time, the issue of crew safety has become not a side issue, but a top priority. Previously, the emphasis was on firepower and mobility, but now the survival factor has gained strategic importance. This determined the vector of development of armored vehicles for decades to come, with an emphasis on modular protection, automatic fire extinguishing systems, and interior security. Thus, the introduction of the wet ammunition was not only a technical innovation, but also a humanitarian victory, an attempt to save the lives of soldiers, ensure the return of experienced fighters to service, and increase the morale of combat units. Sherman, once known as the burning coffin, became a machine that not only fought, but also protected its people. This transformation was made possible by focused engineering work, analysis of combat experience, and the willingness of the American command to make constructive decisions based on real losses and the needs of the front. When in the middle of 1944, wet-lined Sherman tanks began to appear en masse on the Western Front, German intelligence and command did not immediately realize that they were no longer facing the same vehicles they had successfully handled a year ago. Externally, the new Sherman almost did not differ from the previous series. The dimensions, the layout of the tower, the characteristic shapes of the hull, everything looked familiar. But the behavior of tanks in battle was changing. The damaged Shermans began to catch fire less often. The crews began to get out alive more often, and the German soldiers had the feeling that their previous tactics had become less effective. This was an effect that the Germans were not prepared for. A hidden but critically important modification completely changed the vulnerability of the tank, preserving its strength on the battlefield. One of the most remarkable things was that the Germans continued to act based on old data. They considered the Sherman a highly flammable target, especially vulnerable to Faust cartridges and anti-tank shells. This belief persisted not only among the infantrymen, but also in the reports of armored division commanders. Until the end of the war, many of them were convinced that American tanks were shot down with a single shot, and their crew burned out almost instantly. This illusion persisted because the wet ammunition lining had no external signs. There were no new armor plates, screens, or silhouette changes. This allowed the Americans to actually commission an improved machine under the guise of an old one, without revealing their trump cards. German soldiers and officers continued to focus on tactics based on old Sherman vulnerabilities. In particular, they tried to shoot at the sides of the hull or into the rear compartment area, believing that the projectile would certainly cause an explosion of ammunition. But the wet lining, placed deep in the bottom of the tank and surrounded by coolant, has become a reliable protection against such a development. Even with a direct hit to the hull, the chances of a fire dropped dramatically. This meant that the German calculations were wasting valuable time and resources hoping for a result that was no longer guaranteed. In the face of fierce fighting, every ineffective attack resulted in a loss of initiative, time, and combat capability. The ignorance of the enemy became one of the key factors for the success of Sherman in the final period of the war. While Germany was spending resources on the development and production of heavy, technically complex vehicles like the Tiger II, the United States was improving mass-produced armored vehicles, making them safer and more practical. The main difference was in the approach. The Germans sought to create an ideal tank superior to any enemy, while the Americans sought to create a system. The interaction of infantry, artillery, aircraft, and tanks, where the equipment would not be ideal individually, but collectively would work effectively. The secret of wet firing became part of this strategy. It cannot be called an absolute weapon or a miracle technology, but in the context of the general military doctrine, it played a crucial role. Increasing the survivability of the Sherman not only saved the crews, but also allowed them to maintain the pace of the offensive. After all, A damaged but not burned tank could be evacuated and repaired. The surviving crew could return to battle the very next day. Instead of losing both equipment and men, the American units maintained their combat backbone and continued the operation without pause. This was especially important in the conditions of rapid progress after the Normandy landings, when supplies, rotation, and repairs required high efficiency. In addition, the Allies quickly gained moral and psychological benefits from this hidden advantage. The tankers began to transmit information to each other. The new Shermans burn less often, and the wet laying really works. Confidence in technology spread in the units, which was lacking at an early stage of the war. This, in turn, influenced the quality of interaction within the crews, their determination and resistance to stress. Unlike the German crews, who often suffered from overloading with complex mechanisms and a shortage of spare parts, the American tankers received a functional, reliable vehicle adapted to long and intense combat operations. Historically, it is also important that the Germans did not understand the essence of what was happening until the very end of the war. Intelligence did not recognize the structural changes of the Sherman, and not a single frontline directive from the Wehrmacht documented the fact of a massive failure of these vehicles to light up when penetrated. Perhaps this was facilitated by the chaos in the German command structures in 1944-1945, constant retreats, and shortages of fuel and equipment. But anyway, the Allies managed to carry out an engineering transformation that did not provoke a response from the enemy. This is an unprecedented case in the history of tank construction, a key improvement that remained in the shadows until the end of hostilities. Analyzing the significance of wet ammunition in the context of the entire war, it can be argued it was one of those subtle but strategically important innovations that affect the outcome of conflicts no less than the number of guns or the number of armies. The engineering discovery, born out of the pain, reports, and fires of 1942-1943, eventually saved thousands of lives, allowed the U.S. Army to maintain its offensive pace, strengthened morale, and undermined the enemy's confidence in the effectiveness of previous methods of struggle. The Sherman never became the perfect tank. He couldn't defeat Tiger I or Panther alone in a frontal attack. He didn't shine with armor thickness or destructive power, but it became exactly what it was supposed to be: a reliable, safe, mass-produced, and maintainable combat vehicle. And the introduction of wet ammunition turned it from a lighter into a real survival system for tankers, which allowed not only to fight, but also to return alive. And perhaps, this is the most important contribution of Sherman to the victory.